Hello, everyone. So, we're going to talk about Frankenstein 2025. So, this was a Netflix movie primarily released on Netflix with a release in select theaters. It was based, of course, on the famous 1818 novel by Mary Shelley, which was the first science fiction novel, or at least it's widely considered to be the first. So this movie, as everyone knows, probably is one of countless adaptations of this famous story of a scientist who creates a living creature only for it all to go horribly wrong. And it was directed, this version was, by Guillermo del Toro. So, he is an interesting director. He recently directed a version of Pinocchio that was set in fascist 1930s Italy. And this one he sets during the Crimean War in the Victorian period, which is later than 1818. But put a pin in that. We'll come back to it. But my point is, he is a very interesting director who makes interesting choices in his adaptations of famous works. But I think we can safely say that he did a good job with this because he won 3 Oscars, or the movie did, rather. Mostly for makeup, production, design, and stuff like that. And as I was hinting at before, it deviates from the novel in several significant ways, especially in how it treats the topic of disability, which is what we will be discussing today with Frankenstein. But before we can talk about how Frankenstein 2025 deals with disability, I wanted to talk about how horror in general has dealt with disability over the years. So, of course, Frankenstein, the story, is a classic of the horror genre. And horror, from its inception, has always had a problematic relationship with disability. It depicts disability a lot of the time as a means of scaring the audience. In other words, here is a person who looks different. Aren't you scared of them? We see that in the 1930s, especially with movies like Freaks, which is about these circus performers with disabilities in this freak show who are sympathetic on one level because they are subjected to discrimination by this trapeze performer who wants to marry a little person for his money and doesn't actually care about him. But what happens is the freak show performers, they take revenge on this woman for mistreating them, and they turn her into a human duck. In other words, they make her disabled, as if being disabled is a bad thing. And the movie also shows them sort of in a monstrous light because they're really creepy, crawling on all fours as they go to attack the woman. So, as you can see, on one level it's sympathetic, on another level it totally is not. And as far as mental disabilities go, I'm sure y'all know that horror movies have psychotic killers in them, which might represent a not totally accurate version of what a mentally disabled or mentally ill person is really like. So we have things like The Shining and Psycho, and even nowadays, Psycho can be considered an ableist term. So in short, horror has always had a complicated relationship with disability, so let's see how it's handled in Frankenstein. First of all, I wanted to mention various symbols in the movie that I do believe are connected to the theme of disability. For example, we have the ball that Victor has during his demonstration to the Royal College of Surgeons, or what have you. And he tosses the ball in the air and catches it, and that is supposed to represent life. When the ball's in the air, that is birth. When it comes down, or when it lands, rather, that is death. And the short time frame in between is life. And I think the ball, in addition to representing the cycle of life and death, it also has to do with agency, choice, because choice is a big theme in the movie as well. And specifically, it relates to the character of Heinrich, who is Victor's assistant. He catches the ball. He makes a choice to assist Victor. And of course, Heinrich is a disabled character himself, having syphilis. But he dies when he gets mixed up with Victor, because Victor doesn't want him to inhabit the body he's trying to give life to cure his syphilis. So he dies anyway. The point is, he was going to die because of syphilis. Death was inevitable. So that's why we see the ball going up and then going down. And that just goes to show how, even if you are disabled in some way, have some condition like syphilis, you're going to die no matter what, even if you didn't have it. So I think that's one outlook on the state of being disabled the film presents, in addition to the memento mori still life, which I think is significant. So we have the peaches that the model was eating, even though the peaches represent life and beauty. Of course, life and beauty always end, don't they? And I think the model eating the peaches represents that. But we also have Elizabeth, who seems to embrace death when she holds the skull. So the skull, if the peaches are beauty, the skull might be ugliness, and we know that Elizabeth embraces that which is not conventionally attractive. Namely, she makes friends with the monster. And I think she also is unafraid of death, or she's willing to confront it. She certainly is not afraid of condemning the senseless deaths in the Crimean War. And the Crimean War is what supports Victor's experiment, because that's where he gets bodies, and also Heinrich is an arms dealer. So that's where he gets his money. But put a pin in that, we'll come to it later. So the memento mori, I think, also shows that we're all going to die, and that we should value life and cherish the time we have without getting caught up in meaningless conflict, because that will ruin us. So don't ostracize people who are different. Like, for example, the monster. Don't create conflict where there is no unnecessary conflict. And the monster could be disabled, we could say, intellectually speaking at first, and also just the fact that he is deformed in how his body is put together. Elizabeth says we should not fight that. In other words, we should not fight disability or difference. And I think that also comes out in the butterfly, because the butterfly is a creature that is beautiful, and Victor calls the butterfly a prisoner. So even he doesn't value it, even though it's beautiful. And in the book, he says he tries to make the monster beautiful. But he still thinks of it as something to be controlled. And Elizabeth doesn't think of it that way. She sees value in butterflies and in bugs. And she is not put off by quote-unquote lesser life forms. Because, people, when they see a bug, typically smash it. But she knows that even ugly or unintelligent, seemingly unintelligent, or insignificant creatures still have worth, and that's why she makes friends with the creature. And finally, that leads me to the leaf, which shows that bonds between people who are quote-unquote normal and people who are different are possible. And I think the leaf signifies the bond between the monster and Elizabeth. Someone disabled and someone not disabled, and how her supporting him helps him thrive. And yes, I did read something where someone compared the creature to someone with an intellectual disability. And I can totally see that, especially considering the time period when this takes place. So this does take place in the Victorian period, which is later than when the novel was published and is presumably set. And this time saw an explosion in the institutionalization of disabled and mentally ill people. So perhaps the creature in this version is meant to reflect those people who were shut out from society in places like Bedlam. Well, that's not its real name. I think its real name is Bethlehem Hospital. But Bedlam was its nickname, and it's quite infamous for how it mistreated patients, sort of like how the creature is mistreated. And it also, the movie also, like I said before, takes place during the Crimean War. Now, I'm no expert on the Crimean War, but my understanding is it was quasi-religious in nature, the war, and it also was about power imbalance in Europe. I think that's what it really was. It really was about that. But basically, it was the Ottoman Empire versus Russia, and then nations like France and the UK came to help the Ottoman Empire because they feared Russian expansionism, because the Ottoman Empire was losing power, and countries like the UK did not want Russia to have more power. So that's basically what it was about. And it resulted in all sorts of horrible casualties. And the crazy thing about this war in particular is it's the first war that was widely documented, and people, regular civilians, saw these soldiers who came home missing limbs or were disabled in some form or fashion. And this is really where the whole idea of the disabled veteran as a noble, socially significant person came from. So I think the setting, the time period in which the movie is set, is definitely significant to the theme of disability as well. So let's talk about our main characters. We got, first of all, Victor. So Victor is motivated to stop death because of his mother's death and his father's failure to save her. And he actually thinks that his father let his mother die because he was a famous surgeon, so why couldn't Why couldn't he have saved her? And the father says no one can conquer death, but Victor says, I will. So that is his motivation to create the creature. And he comes to resent his father for mistreating him when he was young. But the thing is, he continues the cycle of his father's abuse when he mistreats the creature, when he gets frustrated at the creature and keeps the creature in chains, not unlike an inmate at a lunatic asylum in the Victorian period. And he abuses the creature and doesn't like how the creature does not meet his expectations, just like how Victor could never meet his own father's expectations. And Victor is sort of like a father to the creature, and I think the creature even calls him father at the end. So, despite being abusive towards his creation, he does try to save the creature when he feels remorse, but he loses his leg in the process. When the lab explodes, he tries to destroy the creature in the lab, goes to try to save him, and his leg gets severed. So that is obviously narrative prosthesis. We've just established that Victor is far from the perfect person. In fact, he is quite flawed, morally speaking, to put it lightly. And as we said before when we talked about disability theory, narrative prosthesis is when disability is used to represent moral failing. And I think that's the case with Victor and his prosthetic leg. So let's keep going. I wanted to talk about our second main character, the creature, and I'm calling him the creature because the movie tends to call him the creature, and I question if he really is a monster. So he calls himself a monster when he's talking to the blind man, and Victor calls him wicked and deformed when he tries to persuade Victor to create a companion for him. Wicked and deformed, that sort of implies that being deformed means you are wicked, as if the two are inseparable, which of course is not true. If anything, that's the case with Victor, not the monster, because Victor is missing his leg. And as we established, it is a case of narrative prosthesis because that represents him being wicked. But the monster is not wicked. The monster is not a monster at all. He is just a creature. And not only is he not a bad person, he also, despite his disability, his deformity, he has many super abilities like super strength, invincibility, and immortality. So I think that represents the social model of disability. He is not actually disabled by any means. If anything, he is super powerful. He is only disabled. He is only a monster. His deformity is only a problem because society says so. His death wish may come with unfortunate implications, and the reason I say that is because he wants to die to escape societal prejudice, which is not a very uplifting message for anyone who can relate to the creature, and honestly, that can be any person or group who hasn't felt like an outcast, disabled people included. So it might be not a great message for them if the monster really wants to die because the world just keeps beating him down. Although he does have an arc, where he where he decides to go on. So, yes, that is The Creature. Speaking of The Creature, I needed to say this because I thought it was so glaring it could not be avoided. I think The Creature is meant to be a Christ figure. So the creature is brought to life on these supports that resemble a cross, right? And as if it weren't obvious that this was supposed to be a representation of the crucifixion, when Victor gives his demonstration to the Royal College of Surgeons, Heinrich describes that as a crucifixion. Of course, probably meaning that Victor got crucified by the people who condemned his experiments as unholy. But also, you could say that the corpse that he had on display that he was animating was a crucifixion. And I mean, animated corpse, Christ coming back to life, I think the parallels are pretty obvious. And as a Christ figure, the creature's hand is wounded, as is his side, and the wounds heal, which I think also references the resurrection, and also Christ healing people, right? And like Christ, he befriends outcasts like Elizabeth. Elizabeth is a Victorian woman. She has no say in whom she marries. Heinrich gives her to William, and he even offers her to Victor if Victor will just give him the reanimated body he's created. So, he befriends other societal outcasts, like Elizabeth as a woman, and also like the blind man, who is a disabled person who is on the fringes of society for his disability. He also forgives Victor at the end, which, I'm not sure I would forgive Victor for causing me so much torment, but the creature does forgive him. It's sort of like how Christ forgives all, especially through his sacrifice. So, there we go. To get back to Heinrich, I wanted to talk about him in detail. So, he is Victor's financial backer and lab assistant. To come back to the topic of disability specifically, he is seemingly inspired by Fritz, the hunchbacked assistant in the famous 1931 version. And like Fritz, he too has a disability. He uses a cane in which he stores mercury, and Victor refuses to help him and causes him to die. And I think his syphilis is another case of narrative prosthesis. I don't think it reflects necessarily poorly on his character, but that cane is there to, as a symbol for how, and the cane also has mercury in it, which he uses to help with his syphilis. It's there to show that Victor is bad for refusing to help someone in need like Heinrich, because he is just so consumed with his own ambition in creating the creature, who ends up having a very, very difficult life, to say the least. So I think the syphilis is another example of narrative prosthesis that represents Victor's evil or moral failing. Let's talk about the blind man, who is another prominent disabled character. So, I think he's a positive character. He's like those people that Christ, if the monster is a Christ figure, befriended, healed. In this case, of course, the blind man is not healed. I think he is meant to be sympathetic, and he is kind of helpless. He doesn't really have agency. So I'm not sure, even though he is a good character, morally speaking, although he did kill a person, so I guess he isn't perfect, which is totally not something that happened in the book. Um, he doesn't have agency and he doesn't have a name, which is interesting because in the book he does have a name. So he is not a great, all things considered, depiction of a disabled person after all, because of how helpless and flawed and lacking in an identity he is, because he never even gets a name. And he also gets killed by the wolves, and the family believes the creature killed him, which sort of diminishes the impact of societal prejudice against disabled people, because in the book, the family simply rejects the monster because of how he looks, not because it appears that the monster killed the blind man, which, since the blind man was all bloody, you could get that impression. So what are my final thoughts? My final thoughts are the film doesn't have bad intentions when it comes to representation of disability. It does try to give us some sympathetic characters, in the form of the blind man, the creature, definitely. But at the end of the day, I think it's not a great depiction of disability because it falls back on narrative prosthesis repeatedly. And as such, I don't think it quite sticks the landing when it comes to positive disabled representation. Nonetheless, I think it had good intentions, especially with the creature, who definitely seems to be an example of the social model and serves to show how societal rejection is what disables people. So it's sort of a mixed bag, and I'm leaning more towards the negative side, but that's just what I think. So make of that what you will. I hope this helped you guys in writing the paper, and I will see y'all next time. Thank y'all.
Please comment the answers to or email me the answers to the following questions. 1. What is a way the film's time period is significant to the theme of disability? 2. What is a way that the creature is a Christ figure? 3. What is an example of narrative prosthesis in the film?